Title: The Man in Apartment 4B. The hallway light flickered, casting long, wavering shadows along the cracked walls of the old apartment building. Jenna hesitated at the door of her new home, the sound of the aged, wooden floors creaking under her feet. She had just moved to the city for a new job, and this apartment, though old, was affordable and conveniently close to her office. As she fumbled with the keys, she noticed an old man standing a few doors down, staring at her from the entrance of apartment 4B. His gray hair was disheveled, his eyes dark and hollow like pits, and he wore a stained, threadbare sweater that looked decades old. He didn't move or blink, just stood there, observing her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Jenna quickly unlocked her door and slipped inside, locking it behind her. That first night, she lay in bed, unable to shake the feeling of those eyes piercing through her. The building was eerily quiet except for the faint sound of a TV playing somewhere, the volume low as if someone was trying to listen in on something else. She shrugged off the unease, chalking it up to the newness of the place. But the next morning, as she left for work, she saw the man again. He was still there, standing in the exact same spot, as if he hadn't moved at all. His eyes followed her as she walked past. She offered a polite nod, but he didn't respond, just continued to watch her with that strange, unwavering gaze. Days passed, and every time Jenna stepped into the hallway, the man was there, always in front of apartment 4B, always staring. He never spoke, never moved, just watched. She began to wonder if he even lived there or if he was some kind of building caretaker. She asked a few of her neighbors, but they only shrugged. Some claimed they'd never seen him, while others said he'd been around for as long as they could remember. No one knew his name. One night, curiosity got the better of her. She decided to talk to him. After all, he was just an old man, probably lonely, she reasoned. As she approached him, he didn't react, didn't flinch. Up close, his skin looked waxy, almost lifeless. "Hi, I'm Jenna. I moved in recently. Do you live in 4B?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. He didn't answer, just continued to stare. The silence stretched on until Jenna felt uncomfortable, and she quickly backed away, retreating to her apartment. That night, she couldn't sleep. The shadows on her walls seemed to dance and shift, and every creak of the building sounded like footsteps just outside her door. A few nights later, Jenna was woken by a faint, scraping sound. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The noise was coming from the hallway, a slow, deliberate drag of something heavy against the floor. She crept to her door and pressed her ear against it, holding her breath. The sound continued, growing louder, closer. She peeked through the peephole and saw the old man. He was dragging a large burlap sack down the hallway, his frail frame straining with the effort. Her breath hitched when she saw what appeared to be a foot sticking out from the sack. Jenna's mind raced. She needed to call the police. She grabbed her phone, but when she looked back through the peephole, the hallway was empty. The old man and the sack were gone. She stayed awake the rest of the night, the image of the foot burned into her mind. The next morning, she went straight to the building manager's office. She explained what she had seen, but the manager seemed unfazed. "Look, miss, apartment 4B has been empty for years," he said, scratching his head. "No one's lived there since the accident." Jenna felt a chill run down her spine. "What accident?" she asked. The manager looked at her, his expression turning grim. "About 10 years ago, an old man lived there with his son. They were reclusive, didn't talk much to anyone. One night, the son was found dead in the apartment. They say the old man went mad, tried to hide the body, dragged it down the hallway, just like you described, but the old man disappeared after that. No one's seen him since." Jenna's heart raced. "But I've seen him! He's there every day!" The manager shook his head. "Maybe you should get some rest, miss. This building can be unsettling." Jenna left the office, her mind spinning. Was it a ghost she had been seeing? She needed to know more. That night, she decided to investigate apartment 4B. She waited until the hallway was quiet, then slipped out of her apartment, flashlight in hand. The door to 4B was old and splintered, the paint peeling away. She turned the knob, surprised to find it unlocked. The door creaked open, and she was hit by a musty smell, the air thick with dust. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from her flashlight. She moved through the small living room, noticing that everything was still there, as if frozen in time, old furniture covered in white sheets. a broken TV in the corner. Then she saw it, a photograph lying on a table. It was a picture of the old man, looking much younger, standing next to a boy who seemed to be in his teens. Her heart skipped a beat. This was the old man she had seen, without a doubt. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, her flashlight flickering, and saw the old man standing in the doorway, his face twisted into a hideous grin. His eyes were no longer lifeless, but full of malice. Jenna backed away, fear clawing at her throat. The old man took a step forward. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered in a raspy voice, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the walls themselves. Jenna turned and ran, but the apartment seemed to stretch on endlessly, the walls closing in. She could hear his footsteps, slow and steady, following her. She burst into a room at the end of the hall and slammed the door shut, holding it with all her strength. Then she heard it, a whisper, a child's voice from inside the room. "Help me," it said. Jenna turned, her heart thundering, and saw a small figure in the shadows. It was the boy from the photo, his eyes wide with fear. Before she could scream, the door burst open, and the old man lunged at her. But as he did, the boy stepped in front of her, a bright light emanating from his small body. The old man shrieked, his form dissipating into the darkness like smoke. Jenna blinked, and the room was empty. She was standing in the hallway again, alone. The door to apartment 4B was closed, a rusted padlock hanging from it. She never saw the old man again, but sometimes, late at night, she could still hear the faint, dragging sound in the hallway, a reminder of the secrets that lay within the walls of the old apartment building, and of the boy who never left.
Story number 2.
Title: The Man Next Door. Moving to a new neighborhood was supposed to be a fresh start for Clara. After her recent breakup, the small, quiet town seemed like the perfect place to clear her head. Her new home was quaint, nestled between old, towering trees that cast long shadows over the narrow, winding roads. The house itself had a certain charm, old but well kept, with a garden that would be stunning in the spring. But something about the place felt off from the moment she arrived. The first night was the worst. Clara had barely unpacked when she noticed something strange. Every time she passed by the front window, she felt as though she was being watched. She dismissed it as paranoia, the result of being in an unfamiliar place. But the feeling persisted, an uneasy itch at the back of her mind. By the second night, Clara decided to investigate. She turned off the lights in her living room, hoping to blend into the darkness, and peered through the curtains. Her heart skipped a beat. There, across the street, stood a man. He was motionless, staring directly at her house. Clara tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just another neighbor, out for a late-night walk. Maybe he wasn't staring at her house at all, and she was letting her nerves get the better of her. But when she checked again an hour later, the man was still there, standing as still as a statue. Days passed, and the man continued his nightly vigil. Clara started to dread sundown, knowing that as soon as darkness fell, he would appear. She considered calling the police, but what would she say? That her neighbor was standing outside? It wasn't illegal to stand on the sidewalk, even if it was unsettling. One evening, she decided to break the silence. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when she stepped outside, feeling the cold night air wrap around her like a shroud. The man was already in his usual spot, staring. "Excuse me," Clara called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Can I help you?" The man didn't respond. He didn't move. Clara's skin prickled with fear. Something was very wrong. She took a step closer, squinting to see his face in the dim light. As she approached, she realized he was dressed oddly, his clothes outdated, as if he had stepped out of another time. His face was pale, almost waxen, and his eyes, those cold, empty eyes, never blinked. "Sir?" She tried again, but still he didn't react. A sudden noise from behind startled Clara, and she whipped around, heart pounding. It was just a cat knocking over a trash can in the alley. When she turned back to the man, her breath caught in her throat. He was gone. The street was empty, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. Clara hurried back inside, locking the door behind her. She didn't sleep that night or the next. Her fear grew with each passing day. The man continued to appear, always in the same spot, always staring. She started to avoid looking out the window altogether, the mere thought of those lifeless eyes enough to send shivers down her spine. One night, a week after she first saw him, Clara heard a knock at the door. It was late, far too late for visitors. Her heart raced as she approached the door, every instinct telling her to stay away. But she couldn't ignore it. Maybe it was a neighbor, someone who could explain the strange man. She opened the door a crack, peering out into the darkness. There was no one there, but something on the ground caught her eye. A small, folded note. With trembling hands, Clara picked it up and unfolded it. The message was scrawled in shaky, almost illegible handwriting. "Don't let him in." The note slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the ground. Panic surged through her. Who had left the note? What did it mean? She looked out into the night, searching for any sign of movement, but saw nothing. As she turned to go back inside, something caught her eye. Across the street, the man was there again, but this time, something was different. He wasn't standing on the sidewalk. He was on her front lawn, closer than he had ever been before. Clara slammed the door shut, heart racing. She rushed to the windows, closing the curtains, shutting out the sight of him. The note's warning echoed in her mind. "Don't let him in." She didn't sleep at all that night, sitting in the dark with every light off, listening for any sound. Hours passed, and finally, exhaustion overtook her. She drifted into a fitful sleep, the note still clutched in her hand. The next morning, Clara woke to a loud banging on her door. Her heart leaped into her throat. She hesitated, fear holding her in place. But the banging continued, relentless. She steeled herself and opened the door. A police officer stood on her porch, looking concerned. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked. Clara nodded, though she felt anything but all right. "We received a call from your neighbor," the officer continued. "He said he saw someone standing on your lawn late last night. He's been keeping an eye on your place for the past few nights. Said he noticed the man kept getting closer." Clara's blood ran cold. "My neighbor?" The officer nodded. "Yeah, Mr. Thompson from across the street. He's been worried about you." Clara felt the room spin. "But Mr. Thompson is the man I've been seeing." The officer frowned. "Ma'am, Mr. Thompson is in a wheelchair. He hasn't left his house in years." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. If Mr. Thompson wasn't the man standing outside, then who or what was? The officer left after making sure she was all right, but Clara's mind was racing. She had to know. She hurried across the street to Mr. Medista Thompson's house, knocking urgently on the door. An elderly man answered, his kind eyes filled with concern. "Is everything all right, dear?" "Mr. Thompson, the man I've been seeing outside my house." Clara's voice shook. "Who is he?" Mr. Thompson's expression darkened. "I was afraid of this," he said quietly. "The man you've been seeing, he was the previous owner of your house. He died years ago, but some say he never left. He stands vigil, watching over his home and its new occupants." Clara's blood turned to ice.
Story number 3.
The small town of Ashwood was known for its quaint houses, lined with picket fences and flowering gardens. Every neighbor knew one another, and the community was close-knit. But there was one house that stood out, unsettling the otherwise idyllic street, a decrepit, sagging structure at the end of Maple Lane, shrouded in overgrown ivy and shadows. No one ever saw the owner leave or enter. It was as if the house had been abandoned long ago, except for the faint glow of light visible from behind the cracked curtains at night. The owner of the house was an old man named Mr. Grimley, a name that fit him all too well. He was a reclusive figure, tall and thin, with piercing eyes that seemed to look right through you. The neighborhood children whispered stories about him, saying he practiced dark magic or that he kept the souls of the dead in jars in his basement. Of course, these were just stories. At least, that's what the adults told themselves. Samantha Miller had recently moved to Ashwood with her husband, Michael. They were excited to start a new chapter in their lives, and the town seemed perfect, except for the house at the end of the street. Samantha had always been curious by nature, and it didn't take long before she became fascinated and a little obsessed with the mystery surrounding Mr. Grimley. It started innocently enough. She would glance at the house as she drove by, wondering about the man who lived there. But as the days passed, her curiosity deepened. She noticed things. The way the ivy seemed to creep up the house faster than normal plants should, the strange shapes she could sometimes see moving behind the curtains, and the odd, sickly sweet smell that occasionally wafted from the direction of the house. One evening, as Samantha was watering her garden, she noticed Mr. Burr grimly standing in his yard, staring at her. His eyes were cold, devoid of emotion, but there was something else, something unsettling. He didn't wave or nod, just stared for what felt like an eternity before turning and walking back into his house. Samantha shivered and quickly went inside, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over her. The next day, a package arrived at Samantha's doorstep. It was a small, plain box with no return address. She opened it to find a beautiful, antique-looking key inside, along with a note in elegant handwriting, "To the curious soul." She had no idea who sent it or what it was for, but something in her gut told her it was from Mr. Grimley. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the key. What did it unlock? Why had he given it to her? Unable to sleep, she got up and walked to the window that overlooked Mr. Grimley's house. The light was on again, a dim, flickering glow barely visible through the curtains. The key seemed to pulse with a faint warmth in her hand, almost as if it were alive. Compelled by a force she couldn't understand, Samantha found herself walking across the street, the key clenched tightly in her hand. The air grew colder the closer she got to Mr. Grimley's house. When she reached the front door, she hesitated for only a moment before inserting the key into the lock. To her surprise, it fit perfectly, and the door creaked open with an eerie groan. The inside of the house was a stark contrast to the outside. The air was thick and musty, the walls lined with dusty old portraits of people she didn't recognize. The furniture was antique, covered in a thin layer of dust, and the floorboards creaked with every step. There was no sign of Mr. Grimley. Drawn to the back of the house, Samantha found herself in a dimly lit hallway. The smell she had noticed before was stronger here, sickly sweet, almost like rotting flowers. She followed the scent to a door at the end of the hall, which opened into a small, cluttered room. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with strange objects, jars of murky liquid, old books, and what looked like human bones. In the center of the room was a large wooden table, and on it lay a body. A young woman, pale and lifeless, her eyes wide open in terror. Samantha gasped, covering her mouth to stifle a scream. She recognized the woman. It was Claire, the neighbor who had mysteriously disappeared a few months ago. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Mr. Grimley standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and menacing. Samantha backed away, but there was nowhere to go. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Mr. Grimley smiled, a cold-ish twisted smile that sent chills down her spine. "You're curious, aren't you? You want to know the truth." He stepped closer, and Samantha could see that his eyes were not just cold, they were empty, devoid of any humanity. Before she could react, he grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. "This is where it ends," he said, dragging her toward the table. "You wanted to know, and now you will." Samantha struggled, but his strength was unnatural, far beyond what his frail appearance suggested. He forced her down onto the table, and she felt something sharp prick her neck. Darkness began to creep into the edges of her vision, and she realized with dawning horror that she was being drugged. As the world faded away, she heard Mr. Grimley's voice, distant and echoing. "The garden needs new life. The flowers must bloom again." When Samantha woke, she was no longer in the house. She was lying on soft earth, surrounded by tall, overgrown plants. The sky above was dark, with only a sliver of moon casting a pale light over her. Groggy and disoriented, she tried to sit up, but her limbs were heavy, as if they had turned to lead. Looking around, she realized she was in Mr. Grimley's garden, a garden she had never seen before. The plants were strange, twisted things with dark leaves and flowers that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. They swayed gently, though there was no breeze. And then she noticed something else, something that made her blood run cold. The flowers weren't just growing from the earth, they were growing from bodies, from her body. Her skin was pale and translucent, her veins dark and pulsing as the roots of the plants burrowed into her flesh. Panic surged through her, but she couldn't move, couldn't scream. All she could do was lie there, helpless, as the garden consumed her. In the distance, she heard Mr. Grimley's voice, humming a soft, eerie tune. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was his face, watching her from the shadows, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. The next morning, the people of Ashwood noticed that Mr. Grimley's garden had blossomed overnight. The flowers were more vibrant than ever, their colors writ deep, as if they had been fed by something special. And in the back of their minds, a small, nagging voice whispered that they shouldn't ask questions, that some things were better left unknown. The town returned to its quiet, peaceful routine, and the house at the end of Maple Lane remained shrouded in mystery. No one ever saw Samantha Miller again.
Story number 4.
Title: The Woman in the Window. When Ryan and Lila moved into their new suburban home, everything seemed perfect. The house was spacious, the neighborhood was quiet, and the price was unbeatable. It felt like they had won the lottery. But there was one thing that stood out: an old Victorian house directly across the street. It looked as if it had been abandoned for decades, its windows boarded up, paint peeling from its walls, and a thick layer of ivy creeping up its sides. On their first night, after unpacking boxes and settling in, they decided to relax on their front porch with a bottle of wine. The summer evening was cool, and the cicadas sang in the trees. As they chatted and sipped, Ryan noticed movement in the upstairs window of the old house. "Did you see that?" he asked, setting his glass down. Lila looked over, squinting into the twilight. "See what?" "I swear I saw someone in the window." "Upstairs," Ryan said, pointing. "Look, right there." Lila stared for a few moments. "I don't see anything. Maybe it's just the wind moving the curtains, or a trick of the light." Ryan nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling. There had definitely been something, or someone there. He decided not to mention it again that night. Over the next few days, the uneasiness grew. Each time Ryan glanced at the house across the street, he felt as if someone was watching him, observing his every move. One evening, while taking out the trash, he saw her again, a woman's face in the upstairs window, pale and expressionless. Her hair was long and dark, her eyes empty. "Lila, there's someone in that house!" he exclaimed when he rushed back inside. Lila sighed, setting down her book. "Ryan, we've been through this. The house is abandoned. No one's lived there for years." Ryan shook his head. "I'm telling you, I saw her again. A woman staring at me." Lila gave a small smile. "Maybe you're just tired. The move has been stressful." Ryan nodded, but he wasn't convinced. That night, he found it difficult to sleep. He kept hearing faint noises, like whispering, coming from the direction of the old house. He tried to ignore it, tried to tell himself it was all in his head, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. The next day, he decided to ask around the neighborhood. Most of the neighbors were friendly, but seemed reluctant to talk about the old house. Finally, Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who had lived on the street for decades, gave him a knowing look. "Ah, the old Grayson house," she said, her voice low. "Strange things have happened there, young man. Strange things indeed." Ryan felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" She leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "The last family that lived there, something terrible happened. The mother, Margaret Grayson, lost her mind after her daughter went missing. They say she would stand at that very window you mentioned, night after night, waiting for her daughter to come home. One night, she just disappeared. No one knows where she went, but some say you can still see her, watching, waiting." Ryan felt his skin crawl. "You mean a ghost?" Mrs. Thompson shrugged. "I don't know what to believe, but I'd keep my distance if I were you. That house has a way of keeping people." That night, Ryan couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Thompson had said. He sat on the porch, staring at the old house. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he saw the woman again, standing in the window, her face clearer than ever. This time, she raised a hand and beckoned. "Lila, come here," he called urgently. Lila joined him, her expression skeptical. "Ryan, if you're going to tell me—" "There," he interrupted, pointing at the window. "Tell me you see her." Lila stared, her face pale. I don't see anything." Ryan's frustration mounted. "She's right there, Lila. How can you not see her?" Lila shook her head slowly. Maybe you should see someone, Ryan. This is getting out of hand." Ryan was about to argue, but he realized how he sounded. He decided to drop it, at least for now. The next few days passed uneventfully, and Ryan tried to focus on work and ignore the old house, but every time he passed a window, he felt those eyes on him. He could sense her, always watching, always waiting. One night, as he lay in bed, he heard a faint tapping at their bedroom window. His heart raced. He turned to see a silhouette in the window, Margaret Grayson, standing outside, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes hollow and black. Ryan jumped up, heart pounding, but the figure vanished. He woke Lila, who looked concerned but still unconvinced. He felt like he was going crazy. Then, one evening, Lila came back from the grocery store, her face pale, her hands trembling. "What's wrong?" Ryan asked, noticing her distress. I saw her, Ryan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "In the window. She was there." Ryan's blood ran cold. "Are you sure?" Lila nodded, tears in her eyes. She was waving at me, like she wanted me to come over." That was all Ryan needed to hear. He grabbed a flashlight and decided it was time to end this once and for all. Despite Lila's pleas, he headed across the street, determined to confront whatever was haunting him. As he approached the house, a cold breeze brushed against his skin, and the air seemed to grow thick with an unnatural chill. He tried the front door. It was unlocked. Inside, the house was dark and damp, the air heavy with the scent of mildew. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he made his way up the narrow staircase to the second floor. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He reached the landing and turned towards the room with the window where he'd seen the woman so many times before. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open, and his heart skipped a beat. The room was empty, save for an old, dusty mirror facing the window. As he stepped closer, he saw his reflection, and then another, standing behind him, a woman with long, dark hair, her eyes hollow and lifeless. He spun around, but the room was empty. He turned back to the mirror, and she was closer now, right behind him. She whispered something he couldn't understand, her breath cold on his neck. He felt a force pulling him towards the mirror, the glass rippling like water. Terrified, he backed away, stumbled, and crashed into the doorframe. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the force vanished. Ryan rushed out of the house, heart-pounding, breathless. When he got home, he told Lila everything. She listened, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. As he finished, she turned slowly towards the living room window. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Look." He turned to see the reflection in their window, the woman from the old house, standing in their living room, a sinister smile spreading across her pale face. And then the lights went out.
Story number 5.
Title: The Room Upstairs. Julie and Tom had always dreamed of owning a house in the countryside. After years of saving, they finally found the perfect place. A charming 2-story cottage on the outskirts of a small, picturesque village. The house was old but full of character, with creaky wooden floors, ivy-covered walls, and a spacious garden that stretched out into the woods. It was everything they had ever wanted. Their first few weeks in the new house were idyllic. They spent their days unpacking, decorating, and exploring the surrounding area. The neighbors were friendly, the air was fresh, and the sense of peace was exactly what they had hoped for. But there was one thing that bothered Julie from the start. The door to the room upstairs. The door was old, painted a dull gray that contrasted with the warm tones of the rest of the house. It was at the end of a narrow hallway on the second floor, and no matter how hard they tried, it wouldn't open. Tom had even gone so far as to try forcing it with a crowbar, but the door didn't budge. It was as if it had been sealed shut from the inside. Julie was curious about what lay beyond the door, but Tom shrugged it off. "It's probably just an old storage room," he said. "We'll figure it out eventually." But Julie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She found herself drawn to the door, standing in front of it late at night, listening. There was something about the silence behind the door that unnerved her. It was too quiet, as if the room beyond was holding its breath, waiting. One evening, a few weeks after they moved in, Tom went out for a work trip, leaving Julie alone in the house. It was the first time she had been by herself at night, and the house, once cozy, now felt vast and empty. The wind howled outside, making the old house creak and groan. Julie tried to distract herself by watching TV, but her mind kept drifting back to the door. It was as if it was calling to her, demanding her attention. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Grabbing a flashlight, she made her way upstairs, heart pounding in her chest. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the small windows at the far end. The door seemed to loom larger than before, an imposing presence at the end of the corridor. Julie hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She wasn't sure why she was so afraid, but the feeling of dread was overwhelming. Finally, she took a deep breath and turned the knob. As expected, it didn't move. But as she pulled her hand away, she noticed something strange. The doorknob was cold, much colder than the rest of the house. Julie shivered, backing away from the door. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, the sound almost deafening in the silence. She was about to turn and leave when she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the other side of the door. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping like someone knocking very lightly. Julie froze, every muscle in her body tensing. She stared at the door, listening intently. The tapping continued, growing slightly louder, more insistent. It was coming from the other side of the door, as if someone or something was trying to get out. Panic set in, and Julie stumbled back, nearly tripping over her own feet. She bolted down the stairs, not stopping until she was in the safety of the living room. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she had just heard. Had she imagined it? Was it just the house settling? But deep down, she knew what she had heard was real. Something was in that room. Something that shouldn't be there. Julie spent the rest of the night on the couch, the TV on to drown out the silence. She didn't dare go back upstairs, not even to retrieve her phone. The tapping had been so soft, so subtle, but it had filled her with an overwhelming sense of dread. The next morning, Tom returned, and Julie told him everything. He listened, his expression growing serious. "Maybe there's something trapped in there," he said. "An animal, maybe. We should call someone to check it out." But Julie shook her head. "It didn't sound like an animal, Tom. It sounded like a person." Tom tried to reassure her, but the worry in his eyes betrayed his concern. They decided to call a locksmith, someone who could get the door open and finally put an end to the mystery. The locksmith arrived later that day, an older man with a kind smile and a tool belt that looked well used. Julie watched nervously as he inspected the door, his brow furrowing as he tried the lock. "This is strange," he muttered. "It's not just locked, it's like the door was sealed shut. But don't worry, I'll get it open." He worked for what felt like hours when prying at the door with a series of tools. Julie's anxiety grew with each passing minute, the memory of the tapping still fresh in her mind. Finally, with a loud creak, the door gave way, swinging open to reveal the room inside. Julie and Tom stepped forward, peering into the darkness. The room was small, dusty, and completely empty. There was no furniture, no boxes, nothing. Just bare wooden floors and a single window that let in a sliver of light. But there was something wrong with the air in the room. It was heavy, thick with a coldness that didn't belong, and in the center of the floor, scratched deep into the wood, was a single word: help. Julie's blood ran cold. She could barely breathe, the air in the room pressing down on her, suffocating. She took a step back, feeling the overwhelming urge to flee. But then she heard it again. The tapping. Soft, rhythmic, coming from the walls. Julie's eyes widened in terror as she realized the sound was all around them, closing in. Tom grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward the door. "We need to leave. Now."
Story number 6.
Title: The Boy in the Window. When Sarah moved into the old Victorian house on Elm Street, she was enchanted by its charm. It had been a good deal, almost too good to pass up, so she didn't question it too much. The house was large, with 3 stories, a wraparound porch, and ornate woodwork that spoke of another time. It was exactly the kind of place she'd dreamed of owning. The first few days were a whirlwind of unpacking and settling in. The neighbors were friendly, though there was something about their smiles that seemed strained when they talked about the house. Sarah chalked it up to small-town gossip. Every old house had its stories, after all. But she couldn't ignore the fact that they seemed almost relieved when she mentioned that she was living alone. It wasn't until the 3rd night that Sarah first noticed the boy in the window. She was in the living room, relaxing with a cup of tea after a long day of work, when she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. She turned her head, looking out the window toward the street, and there he was, a boy, no older than 7 or 8, standing in the upstairs window of the house across the street. He was staring directly at her. Sarah blinked, surprised. The boy was pale, with dark hair and wide eyes that seemed almost too large for his face. He didn't move, just stood there, watching her. She smiled and gave a small wave, thinking he might be curious about the new neighbor, but the boy didn't react. After a few moments, he stepped back into the shadows and disappeared from view. The next day, Sarah asked her neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, about the boy. "Oh, you must have seen the Davis boy," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice a little too quick. Well, they keep to themselves, the Davises. Don't see them out much." Sarah accepted the explanation, though something about the encounter bothered her. She decided to forget about it, dismissing it as the curiosity of a lonely child. But over the next few nights, she began to notice the boy more frequently. Every evening, around the same time, he would appear in the same window, staring out at her house. He never waved back, never acknowledged her in any way, just watched. The unease started to build. There was something off about the boy. His stillness, the way he seemed to appear and disappear without warning. It was unsettling. And there was something else that gnawed at her, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. One evening, after a particularly long day, Sarah decided to confront the situation head on. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, and she needed to know what. She crossed the street and knocked on the door of the Davis house. The door creaked open, and an older woman, her face lined with age, peered out. Her eyes were dull, and there was a weariness in her voice when she spoke. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone flat. "Hi, I'm Sarah. I just moved in across the street," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice light. "I've seen a boy in the upstairs window a few times and just wanted to say hello. Is he your son?" The woman's face paled, and for a moment, Sarah thought she might slam the door in her face. Instead, she let out a long, slow breath. "You must be mistaken," the woman said quietly. "I don't have any children." Sarah frowned. "I'm sure I've seen him. He's there almost every night." The woman shook her head, her eyes filled with something Sarah couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or sorrow. "You need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, just go." Sarah hesitated, but the woman's pleading expression left her no choice. She nodded, offering a quiet apology before backing away. The door closed firmly behind her, the sound echoing in the still evening air. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Her mind kept returning to the boy, the strange way he seemed to vanish into the darkness and the fear in the woman's eyes. There was something deeply wrong, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. At around midnight, she finally gave up on sleep and went to the window. The house across the street was dark, but she knew he would be there. She waited, her eyes fixed on the upstairs window. Minutes passed, then an hour, but the boy didn't appear. Sarah felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Maybe she had imagined it after all. Maybe there was nothing to worry about. But then, just as she was about to turn away, she saw movement. Her breath caught in her throat as the boy stepped into view, standing in the window as he always did. But this time, something was different. His eyes were locked on hers, and for the first time, he smiled. The smile was wrong, too wide, too cold. It sent a chill down her spine, and she stumbled back from the window, heart pounding. She didn't understand why, but that smile filled her with an overwhelming sense of dread. The next day, Sarah was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. She went to the local library, digging through old records and newspaper archives, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. It didn't take long for her to find it. In a dusty old newspaper from nearly 50 years ago, she found a headline that made her blood run cold. "Tragic fire claims young life on Elm Street." The article detailed a fire that had destroyed the Davis house, killing a young boy named Michael who had been trapped inside. The parents survived, but the boy's body was never recovered. The fire was believed to have started in the upstairs room, Michael's bedroom, the room where she had seen him. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the article, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The boy she had been seeing wasn't a neighbor's child. He was a ghost, trapped in the house where he had died all those years ago. That night, Sarah couldn't bring herself to look out the window. She kept the curtains drawn, the lights on, but she could feel his presence, watching her from across the street. She knew he was there, waiting. And then, in the dead of night, the knocking started. It was soft at first, almost like a tree branch tapping against the window. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder, more insistent. Sarah pulled the covers over her head, her heart racing. The knocking continued, rhythmic and steady, as if someone was trying to get in. Suddenly it stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Sarah's breath hitched as she peeked out from under the covers. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of her bedside lamp. But something was wrong. The air felt thick, oppressive, and there was a chill that seemed to seep into her bones. And then she saw it. The figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was the boy, Michael. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and dark, but there was something almost pleading in his expression. He looked at her, his lips moving soundlessly as if trying to speak. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the ghostly figure, too terrified to move. She wanted to scream, to run, but she was frozen in place, her eyes locked on his. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the boy vanished, dissolving into the darkness. The room was silent again, but the feeling of dread lingered. Sarah knew then that she couldn't stay in the house. The boy wasn't just watching her. He was trying to reach out, trying to pull her into his world, the world of the dead. The next morning, she packed her bags and left the house on Elm Street, never looking back. She never spoke of what she had seen, but the memory of the boy in the window haunted her for the rest of her life. And though the house remains empty, the people in the village still talk about it. They say that on certain nights, if you stand on the street and look up at the old Davis house, you can see a boy in the upstairs window staring out into the darkness, and sometimes, just sometimes, he smiles.
Story number 7.
The man in the window. Jenny had lived in the old Victorian house for nearly 2 years. It was her dream home, with its towering spires, intricate woodwork, and a wraparound porch that looked out over a sprawling lawn. Despite its beauty, the house had a reputation in the small town of Harrow's End. Locals whispered about its dark history, though Jenny never paid much attention to the rumors. She loved the house too much to let old stories bother her. The previous owner, Mrs. Greaves, had been an elderly woman who kept to herself. After her death, the house sat empty for years before Jenny bought it at a surprisingly low price. She chalked up the discount to the house's age and the work it needed, not considering that the locals' reluctance to buy it might be tied to something more sinister. It wasn't long after she moved in that strange things began to happen. At first, they were small. A door closing on its own, a shadow in the corner of her eye, or the feeling of being watched. Jenny dismissed them as quirks of an old house settling, or her imagination playing tricks on her. One night, after a long day at work, Jenny was getting ready for bed when she noticed something odd. The curtains in the bedroom were slightly open, just enough for her to see outside. The view was of the neighbor's house across the street, but what caught her attention was a figure standing in the window of that house, staring directly at her. The figure was tall and shadowy, impossible to make out in detail. It stood perfectly still, its head slightly tilted as if observing her. A chill ran down Jenny's spine, but she told herself it was just a neighbor, curious about the new resident in the old house. She pulled the curtains closed and tried to forget about it. The next morning, Jenny decided to introduce herself to her neighbors. She walked across the street and knocked on the door of the house where she had seen the figure. A middle-aged woman answered, her face warm and friendly. "Hi, I'm Jenny. I just moved into the house across the street," she said, gesturing to her Victorian home. The woman smiled. "Oh, hello. I'm Karen. Welcome to the neighborhood. It's good to see someone finally moved into that place." Jenny hesitated, unsure how to bring up what she had seen. "Last night, I thought I saw someone in the window watching me. I wasn't sure if it was one of your family members." Karen's smile faltered slightly. "In the window? No, it was just my husband and me last night, and we were in bed early. Maybe you saw something else? That house of yours can play tricks on the eyes, I hear." Jenny laughed it off, though her unease lingered. She thanked Karen and returned home, determined not to let her imagination get the better of her. But that night, the figure appeared again. It was in the same window, standing as still as before, staring at her through the gap in the curtains. This time, Jenny felt a wave of fear. She closed the curtains quickly, her hands trembling. It was too strange to be a coincidence. Something was wrong. The next few nights were the same. No matter what time she went to bed, the figure was always there, watching her. It never moved, never made any sign of acknowledging her other than its unnerving stare. Desperate for answers, Jenny decided to confront the situation head-on. One evening, as the sun began to set, she walked across the street and stood outside the house. The window where she had seen the figure was dark, but she could still feel its presence. Gathering her courage, Jenny knocked on the door. Karen answered again, her expression curious. "Jenny, what a surprise! Everything okay?" Jenny forced a smile. "I'm sorry to bother you again, but I've been seeing that figure in the window every night. I'm sure it's not my imagination. I don't mean to pry, but is there someone else living here?" Karen's face grew serious. She glanced back into the house before stepping outside and closing the door behind her. "Jenny, there's something you should know. The figure you're seeing, it's not anyone living here. The truth is, we've seen it too." Jenny's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Karen looked uncomfortable, as if she wasn't sure how much to say. "That window, it's been a problem for a while now. We've tried everything, blocking it, changing rooms, even having the house blessed, but it doesn't stop. Whoever, or whatever it is, it's tied to that window. It's been like this ever since we moved in." Jenny felt a cold dread settle over her. "But why is it looking at me? Why now?" Karen shook her head. "I don't know. Maybe it's curious about you, or maybe it's something about that house of yours. All I can say is that it's best to ignore it. Don't engage, don't acknowledge it. It feeds on attention." That night, Jenny tried to follow Karen's advice. She kept the curtains tightly closed, refusing to look at the window. But the feeling of being watched was overpowering. She couldn't sleep, the image of the figure burning in her mind. Around midnight, she heard a noise, a soft tapping, like fingers on glass. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized the sound was coming from her bedroom window, the window that faced the figure. Jenny sat up in bed, her breath shallow. The tapping continued, persistent and rhythmic. She knew she shouldn't, but the compulsion to look was too strong. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. The curtains were slightly parted, and through the gap she saw the figure, closer than ever before. It was no longer across the street, and it was right outside her window, staring in at her. Jenny screamed, jumping out of bed and stumbling backward. The tapping grew louder, more frantic. The figure began to move, its shadowy form pressing against the glass as if trying to get inside. In a panic, Jenny grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the device. As she tried to explain the situation to the operator, the tapping suddenly stopped. The room fell deathly silent. Cautiously, Jenny approached the window, phone still in hand. The figure was gone. She pulled back the curtains, half expecting it to be standing right there, but the street outside was empty. The police arrived within minutes, but there was nothing they could find. No sign of forced entry, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been outside her window. They reassured Jenny that it was likely a prank or her imagination, but she knew what she had seen. Over the next few days, Jenny didn't sleep much. She kept all the windows locked, the curtains drawn, but the sense of being watched never left her. She considered leaving the house, but she had nowhere else to go. Besides, the house had been her dream, and she wasn't ready to give it up. But one night, as she sat in the living room, trying to distract herself with TV, she heard a noise. A soft creak, like a door opening. She froze, listening. The sound was coming from upstairs. Heart pounding, Jenny grabbed a flashlight and cautiously climbed the stairs. The creaking grew louder, more insistent, leading her to the bedroom. The door was ajar, slowly swinging open. She hesitated at the threshold, the flashlight trembling in her hand. With a deep breath, she pushed the door fully open and shined the light into the room. The window was wide open, curtains billowing in the breeze, and then she saw it. A figure standing in the middle of her room. It was not just a shadow anymore. It was a man, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to suck the light out of the room. His face was twisted into a cruel smile. "You shouldn't have looked," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "You invited me in." Jenny screamed, dropping the flashlight as she turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. She fumbled for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The man was behind her now, his breath cold against her neck. "I've waited so long," he whispered, his voice a mix of anticipation and malice. "So long for someone to see me."
Story number 8.
Title: The Whispering Walls. After her divorce, Emily decided she needed a fresh start. She moved to a small, rural town where she found a charming two-story house for an unbelievable price. It was the kind of house she had always dreamed of. A wraparound porch, large bay windows, and a sprawling yard that stretched back into a thick line of trees. She couldn't believe her luck. The real estate agent seemed eager to finalize the sale, perhaps too eager, but Emily was too excited to care. She moved in on a crisp autumn afternoon. As she unpacked, she noticed something peculiar, faint scratches on the walls in the upstairs hallway. They were subtle, like claw marks, thin and jagged, stretching from one end of the hall to the other. She ran her fingers over them, feeling the grooves in the paint. She shrugged it off. The house was old, after all, and probably had a lot of wear and tear. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard a soft noise. It was faint, like distant murmuring, just below the threshold of understanding. She sat up, listening intently, but it stopped as suddenly as it had begun. She shook her head, laughing at her own paranoia. "It's just an old house settling," she told herself. But the next night, it happened again. The whispers were clearer this time, like hushed voices conversing just beyond her bedroom door. She couldn't make out the words, but there was a strange urgency to them, a pleading tone that sent a shiver down her spine. She got up and opened the door, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway and the soft ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Over the next few days, the whispers became a nightly occurrence. They grew louder, more insistent, and Emily started to feel an unsettling presence in the house. She would catch glimpses of movement from the corner of her eye, shadows darting past the doorways, shapes that seemed to vanish the moment she turned to look. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was just her imagination running wild in an unfamiliar place. But one night, as she was brushing her teeth in the upstairs bathroom, she heard it. Clear as day, a voice, a child's voice, whispering right next to her ear. "Help us, please." Emily dropped her toothbrush, her heart hammering in her chest. She spun around, but the bathroom was empty. The air was thick, cold, and heavy with something she couldn't name. She quickly left the bathroom, shutting the door behind her, trying to shake the feeling that she was not alone. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Emily visited the local library the next morning. She asked the librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, about the history of her new house. The librarian's face darkened when she heard the address. "That house," she began slowly. "No one has lived there for more than a few months in over a decade. They all leave, you see, or worse." "Worse?" Emily asked, feeling a chill run down her spine. The librarian sighed. "There was a family who lived there about 20 years ago, the Carters. They had 2 young children, a boy and a girl. One night, the mother went mad, or at least that's what people say. She claimed to hear voices in the walls, whispers telling her to do terrible things. Then one night, the whole family vanished. No one knows where they went, but strange things have happened in that house ever since." Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "Did anyone ever find out what happened to them?" The librarian shook her head. "Some say the house kept them." Emily returned home, her mind racing. That night, the whispers began again, louder than ever, like a chorus of voices trapped behind the walls. She sat up in bed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. This time, she decided she wouldn't ignore it. She grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound down the hallway. The whispers seemed to be coming from the wall near the end of the hall, the one with the claw marks. She placed her ear against it, and the sound became clearer. "Help us. Set us free. She won't let us leave." A cold sweat dripped down her neck. She backed away from the wall, but the whispers grew louder, more frantic. She grabbed a hammer from the toolbox she had yet to unpack and, heart racing, began to chip away at the plaster. As she did, the voices seemed to intensify, as if they were calling her, guiding her. She pried away pieces of the wall until she exposed the old wooden boards beneath. Her hammer struck something solid and hollow, a small door about 3 feet high hidden behind the wall. The whispers were almost deafening now, a chorus of pleading voices echoing in her mind. Her hands trembled as she reached for the small latch on the door and pulled it open. Inside, she saw a narrow, dark passageway, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. The air was cold, and she could smell something damp and rotten like old earth and decay. Without thinking, she crawled inside. the whispers guiding her deeper into the dark. She could hear the faint sound of children crying, calling for their mother. She kept going, her hands brushing against the cold, rough walls. Suddenly, her flashlight flickered and went out. She was plunged into darkness. But the whispers continued, more desperate, more insistent. Then she felt it, a cold hand gripping her ankle. She gasped and tried to pull away, but the grip tightened. The whispers stopped, replaced by a soft, chilling laughter that seemed to come from all around her. She turned, struggling to see in the dark, and felt another hand on her shoulder, then another on her wrist. Panic surged through her as she realized the hands were pulling her deeper into the passage. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The walls seemed to close in, pressing against her, the air growing colder and colder. Suddenly, she heard a woman's voice, soft and calm, cutting through the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. "This is my home, and now it's yours, too." Emily's vision blurred as she struggled against the unseen hands. She managed to break free and scramble backward out of the narrow passage. She tumbled into the hallway, breathless, heart racing. She slammed the hidden door shut and staggered back, staring at the wall in disbelief. The whispers stopped. The house fell silent, but the air was thick with something heavy, a presence she could almost feel breathing down her neck. The next morning, she packed her bags and left without looking back. She didn't care about losing money on the house. She just wanted to be gone. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the house, dark and silent, standing like a sentinel among the trees. But just before she rounded the bend, she saw a figure in the upstairs window. A woman with dark hair, staring at her with hollow eyes and a thin, cruel smile. A month later, a new family moved in. They were happy to find such a bargain in a quiet town. As they unpacked, their little girl ran upstairs to explore. Minutes later, she called down, "Mommy, Daddy, come see! There's a tiny door in the wall!" And from behind that door, they heard the faintest whisper, "Help us."
Story number 9.
The Red House on the Hill. For years, the Red House on Raven Hill had been the subject of local legend. The house, an imposing, crumbling mansion, was the only structure on the desolate hill. Its windows were dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring down at the town below. The locals avoided it, claiming it was cursed, haunted by the ghosts of those who had died there. They said the house was a place where darkness gathered, where evil seeped into the walls. Jessica had heard the stories all her life. She grew up in the nearby town of Ashford, where everyone had a tale to tell about the Red House. Her parents had warned her to stay away from it, but as a teenager, the warnings only fueled her curiosity. There was something about the house that drew her in, a fascination she couldn't explain. Now, years later, Jessica was back in Ashford after living in the city for a decade. Her parents had passed away, leaving her their modest home just a few miles from Raven Hill. Life in the city had been fast-paced and relentless, and Jessica was ready for a change. She wanted peace and quiet, a chance to reconnect with her roots. But the Red House still intrigued her. She often found herself staring at it from a distance, wondering about its history, about the lives that had been lived and lost within its walls. One late autumn evening, Jessica decided to satisfy her curiosity once and for all. The sky was overcast, casting an eerie glow over the town as she drove up the winding road to Raven Hill. The closer she got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees lining the road seemed to lean toward her, their bare branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. When she arrived at the house, she parked her car at the edge of the overgrown driveway and got out. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The house loomed before her, its red paint peeling, the front door slightly ajar. It looked as if it had been abandoned for years, but there was a strange sense of vitality about it, as if it were merely sleeping, waiting to awaken. Jessica hesitated at the threshold. The stories she had heard as a child came flooding back, stories of people who had disappeared after entering the house, of strange noises and lights seen at night, of ghosts that wandered the halls. But she was no longer a child, and she refused to be scared off by old wives' tales. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under her weight, and the air was stale and cold. The house was dark, the only light coming from the gray sky outside. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like tattered curtains. Jessica moved cautiously through the rooms, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The furniture was old and covered with sheets, as if the owners had left in a hurry and never returned. But what struck her most was the feeling that she was not alone. The house seemed to breathe around her, its walls whispering secrets she couldn't quite hear. In the dining room, she found a long table set with dusty plates and tarnished silverware, as if waiting for a meal that would never be served. A single candle stood in the center of the table, unlit but pristine, as if it had been placed there only moments before. As she explored further, she came across a staircase leading to the second floor. The steps were steep and narrow, and they groaned as she ascended. When she reached the top, she found herself in a long hallway lined with doors, each one closed. A cold draft blew through the hall, making her shiver. She opened the first door on her right and found a bedroom. The bed was unmade, the sheets rumpled and stained. A large wardrobe stood against one wall, its door slightly ajar. Jessica approached it, her heart pounding in her chest. She had a sudden irrational fear that something was inside, waiting for her. Slowly, she pulled the wardrobe door open. Inside, she found nothing but a few moth-eaten clothes hanging on wire hangers. She let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding and closed the door. The next room was a study, filled with bookshelves that sagged under the weight of dusty old tomes. A large desk sat in the center of the room, papers strewn across it, as if someone had left in the middle of their work. Jessica sifted through the papers, but they were covered in strange symbols and writing she couldn't understand. As she turned to leave, she noticed something on the wall behind the desk, a painting she hadn't seen before. It was a portrait of a man, tall and thin, with sharp features and deep-set, piercing eyes. The man's expression was stern, almost angry, and his gaze seemed to follow her as she moved. Unnerved, Jessica left the study and continued down the hall. She opened each door she came across, finding more bedrooms, a bathroom, and a storage room filled with old, broken furniture. But at the end of the hall, she found a door that was different from the others. It was heavier, made of dark wood, with a large iron handle. She grasped the handle and pulled the door open. Inside was a small room, barely more than a closet, with a single window that looked out over the back of the house. The room was empty, except for a large, old-fashioned mirror leaning against the far wall. The mirror was ornate, with a gilded frame and a surface that was strangely free of dust. It seemed out of place in the otherwise decrepit house. Jessica approached it, her reflection growing larger as she neared. She stopped in front of it and stared at herself. For a moment, everything was still. Then the reflection in the mirror began to change. At first, it was subtle, a shadow passing behind her, a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. She turned to look, but there was nothing there. When she looked back at the mirror, her reflection was no longer her own. The face staring back at her was the man from the painting in the study. His eyes were dark and hollow, his mouth twisted into a cruel smile. Jessica's breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled backward, her heart racing. The man in the mirror raised a hand and beckoned her closer. "No," she whispered, backing away. But the mirror's surface began to ripple, as if it were made of liquid. The man's hand reached out from the mirror, long and pale, his fingers curling toward her. Jessica turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The air grew colder and the room seemed to shrink around her. The man's arm extended further from the mirror, followed by his shoulder, then his head. He stepped out of the mirror as if passing through a doorway, his body impossibly thin and tall. His eyes locked onto hers, and she felt a wave of terror wash over her. "Who are you?" She managed to gasp, her back pressed against the door. The man smiled, a slow, menacing grin. "I am the keeper of this house," he said, his voice low and raspy. "And now, you are mine." Jessica tried to scream, but no sound came out. The man reached for her, his cold fingers brushing her skin. In that moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of despair, as if all hope had been drained from her. As his hand closed around her wrist, a sudden force pulled her forward, and she was yanked toward the mirror. The surface rippled again, and she was pulled inside, the world outside fading into darkness. The last thing she saw was the man's twisted smile, his hollow eyes gleaming with satisfaction. When Jessica didn't return home that night, the townspeople assumed she had left town again. Days turned into weeks, and no one heard from her. The red house on Raven Hill remained empty, its windows dark and lifeless. But sometimes on quiet nights, those who dared to venture close to the house claimed they saw a figure standing in the window, a tall, thin man with hollow eyes, watching and waiting. And beside him, they said, was a woman, her face pale and terrified, her hand pressed against the glass as if pleading for help that would never come.
Story number 10.
Title: The House on Ridgeway Lane. When Jenna and Mark stumbled upon the house on Ridgeway Lane, it felt like fate. They had been searching for a place to call their own for months, and this old, secluded farmhouse seemed perfect. The property was vast, surrounded by dense woods, with a long gravel driveway that wound its way up to the house. It was peaceful, quiet, and far removed from the bustle of the city, a dream come true. The house itself was large, 2 stories tall, with wide windows that looked out over the fields and forests beyond. It had an air of forgotten grandeur, the kind of place that had seen better days but still held a certain charm. The realtor mentioned that it had been on the market for years, but that didn't bother Jenna or Mark. They were excited to restore it to its former glory. After signing the papers, they moved in quickly, eager to start their new life. The first few days were a whirlwind of unpacking and settling in. Jenna loved the way the morning light streamed through the windows, and Mark spent hours exploring the grounds, planning out the renovations they would need to make. Everything seemed perfect. But as the sun set on their 3rd night in the house, Jenna started to notice things she couldn't explain. It began with the noises. Soft, barely audible at first. A creak here, a thud there, as if the old house were settling. Jenna didn't think much of it. Old houses made noises, after all. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps echoed through the halls, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking from room to room. She mentioned it to Mark, but he just shrugged. It's probably the wind, or the house adjusting to us, he said, though Jenna could tell he was trying to convince himself as much as her. That night, they both heard the knocking. It was past midnight, and they were lying in bed, trying to ignore the creaks and groans of the old house, when the sound of knuckles rapping on wood cut through the silence. It came from downstairs, a steady, rhythmic knock on the front door. Mark got up, grumbling about late-night visitors, but when he opened the door, there was no one there. Just the empty night, cold and still. Jenna joined him at the door, peering out into the darkness. Maybe it was just a branch, she suggested, though she didn't believe it herself. Mark nodded, but his eyes kept drifting to the darkness beyond the porch. Yeah, probably. The knocking continued every night after that, always at the same time, always the same steady rhythm. Mark checked the door each time, but it was always the same, nothing but empty night. They started locking all the doors and windows, but it made no difference. The knocking persisted, echoing through the house like a bad omen. Then other things began to happen. Jenna would wake up in the middle of the night, certain that she had heard someone whispering her name. Mark found the tools he had left in the garage strewn across the yard, as if someone had gone through them and discarded what they didn't need. Lights flickered, cold drafts appeared out of nowhere, and strange shadows danced across the walls. The worst was the feeling of being watched. No matter where they were in the house, Jenna and Mark both felt eyes on them, an oppressive presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. It was as if something in the house was aware of them, studying them, waiting. One night, as they were lying in bed, the knocking started again. But this time it was different. It was louder, more insistent, and it wasn't just coming from the front door. The sound echoed from every direction, downstairs, upstairs, even from the walls around them. It was as if the house itself were alive, trying to communicate with them. Jenna and Mark sat up, their hearts pounding. The air in the room was thick, heavy with a sense of dread, and then the knocking stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Suddenly the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. "Mark?" Jenna whispered, reaching out for him in the dark. But there was no response. "Mark?" She called again, louder this time, panic rising in her chest. Her hand finally found him, but he was cold, his skin clammy. She could feel him shaking, but he didn't say a word. It was as if he was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. "Mark, what's wrong?" Jenna pleaded, but then she heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the foot of the bed. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The growl was followed by the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor, moving closer to them. Jenna's breath caught in her throat as she realized whatever it was coming for them. Desperately, she reached for the lamp on the nightstand, fumbling to turn it on. Her hands shook so badly that it took her several tries, but finally, the light flickered to life, casting a dim glow across the room. The room was empty. There was nothing at the foot of the bed, nothing in the shadows. The growling had stopped, the dragging sound gone. But Mark was still silent, still cold. Jenna turned to him, shaking his shoulder. "Mark, please." But when he finally looked at her, his eyes were blank, wide and staring, as if he had seen something too terrible to comprehend. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. "Mark!" Jenna screamed, shaking him harder, but he didn't respond. Terrified, Jenna jumped out of bed and ran to the door, yanking it open. She needed to get out of the house, to get help, but as she reached the top of the stairs, she froze. Standing at the bottom of the stairs was a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette that seemed to absorb the light around it. It had no face, no features, just an overwhelming darkness that radiated malice. And it was staring directly at her. Jenna's scream died in her throat as the figure began to move, slowly ascending the stairs, one deliberate step at a time. The temperature dropped, the air growing colder with each step it took. Jenna backed away, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to move. The figure reached the top of the stairs, its presence suffocating. Jenna could feel the darkness closing in around her, a crushing weight that pressed down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. Then, just as it reached out toward her, the lights flickered back on, and the figure vanished. Jenna collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The oppressive feeling lifted, but the terror remained. She scrambled back to the bedroom, finding Mark still sitting on the bed, staring blankly at the wall. She grabbed his arm, shaking him hard. "Mark, we need to leave. Now!" But he didn't respond. It was as if he were in a trance, completely disconnected from the world around him. Jenna tried to pull him up, but he was too heavy, too unresponsive. Panic surged through her as she realized she couldn't do this alone. Suddenly, Mark's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a grip so tight it hurt. His eyes snapped to hers, but they were no longer blank, they were filled with fear. "Jenna," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "it's not the house." "What?" Jenna asked, her heart racing. "It's not the house that's haunted," Mark said, his voice trembling. "It's us, we brought it here." Jenna's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Do you remember the old man?" Mark asked, his eyes wide with terror. "The one who sold us the house?" Jenna nodded, her mind racing. The old man who had sold them the house had been strange, with a knowing smile that had unsettled her at the time. He had insisted on shaking their hands before they left, a firm, lingering handshake that had felt wrong somehow. He said the house needed new blood," Mark whispered, his grip tightening on Jenna's wrist. "I thought he was just being weird, but Jenna, I think he cursed us." A cold chill ran down Jenna's spine as she remembered the old man's words. He had smiled as he handed over the keys, saying something about the house needing life again, about it being empty for too long. And now they had brought life back to it. Something that had been waiting, watching in the shadows. "We have to leave," Jenna said, her voice shaking. "We have to leave now." But as she tried to pull Mark to his feet, the knocking started again, louder this time, echoing through the entire house. It was coming from every direction, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, as if the house itself were alive, trying to break free. Mark's eyes filled with terror as he looked at Jenna. "It won't let us go." Jenna felt a cold hand close around her heart as the realization set in. They were trapped. The house, or whatever malevolent force they had brought with them, wasn't going to let them leave. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, and Jenna knew they were out of time. She grabbed Mark's hand, pulling him up with all the strength she had left. "We have to try," she cried, dragging him toward the door. But as they reached the threshold, the door slammed.